All right, I tried to make this not too long so we'd have time to chat at the end. This topic today on the Lunch and Learn is alpha. This is actually a really huge topic. There's just stacks and stacks of research going back decades on the topic of alpha and what it is. And of course, as you recall, it was the first brainwave discovered, and it was discovered back, I believe, in the 1930s, thereabout. And then slowly the other bands were discovered as well. Beta, of course, was the second band discovered, and the people who discovered alpha and beta did experiments on when the brain switches from one frequency to the other, and we'll talk about that a little bit. That theme has survived into this day, all the way into the research of Barry Sterman and what he discovered about pilots and alpha and the switching mechanism that takes place there. Okay, so Hans Berger started off with the discovery of alpha, and what it looked like at the time he discovered it is the same it looks like today. You can see there's different waveforms here, and you can see alpha in the lineup of the different waveforms. And I'm going to see if I get one of my tools out here. Here's your raw EEG, then here's an alpha, and then here's a beta, and here's a theta, and here's a delta. This is a very nice presentation. It's nice and clear and clean. And you can see how all these frequencies beat together to produce this complex frequency form up here. And you'll notice the alpha, it gets big, and then it gets small, and then it gets big for a bit, and then it gets small, and then it starts to get big again and gets small. We call that spindling. And you can see it especially well right at the beginning, where it starts out small, gets big, gets small again, and then it gets big. The beta waves spindle also, but it's not as obvious. In the early days, they didn't notice it quite a bit, but you can see some large beta and then small beta here. But it's not quite as pronounced as the alpha. And the alpha's got very smooth waveforms. Now the theta has got much longer waves because it's fewer waves per second. And you can see this is giving you waves a second, and here you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 waves in this second here. As the theta goes up and down, it changes form. Sometimes it almost looks like alpha, and interestingly enough, when alpha slows down, and it can, and we'll talk about that in a minute, it can begin to look like theta, and it can be hard to tell the two apart in some ways. And then at the bottom we have delta. Not hard to tell that one apart from the others. Here's another sample of alpha. You can see there's kind of two forms here. Here's that spindling form we just saw, and that's a very healthy alpha. And if you look down here, you can see it's spindling and then getting smooth, and then spindling and then getting smooth again. When it starts to get steady like this, that's not something we want to see. That's somebody just completely spacing out when it's spindling like that, and we'll explain why. That also shows up a lot with people with thyroid problems and so forth. So a steady alpha is not the optimal alpha. You like to see alpha coming and going and spindling. Alpha is the frequency that is least affected by muscle tension or line noise. So it's the one that you can easily get the most cleanest on your recordings. And you can see here, this is left over from our presentation on beta and artifact. You can see here are the frequency bands from 0 to 180. Here's 60 hertz right here. And you can see that's a long way from alpha, which is way down here. So it rarely gets into alpha unless it's extremely high in amplitude and very strong. And then here you can see the muscle tension, which can get as low as 13 hertz So it doesn't quite make it down to alpha, but almost, because alpha goes up to 12 or 12.5. Now, there has been some research that suggests that you can get contamination down into the alpha band, but it's not that common. So that's a nice thing. It's easy to work with because it's a pretty clean frequency to work with overall. This is the topic that confuses the people most, especially when they get just started in neurofeedback. When we close our eyes, the alpha dominant frequency is between 9.5 and 10.5 hertz, or 9.5 and 10.5 cycles a second. And that concept of dominant frequency is confusing until you consider the fact that alpha is made up of the frequencies of 8 hertz, 9 hertz, 10 hertz, 11 hertz, and 12 hertz. So if we look at alpha between 8 and 12 hertz, which is the standard band that we usually look at, some people go up to 12.5 or 13. And what you can see is that each band has a different amount of energy in it. So when we take that raw EEG and break it down, just like a prism breaks down sunlight, when we break it down with digital filters in the computer, we get these bands, and we have them colored here like a rainbow, but in fact they have no color, they just differ in frequency. And we can see that the 8 to 9 hertz band is pretty low, 11 to 12 is at least 2 or 3 times higher, but then we can see the 9.5 to 10.5 is quite high. And so that would be the typical dominant frequency amplitude in the back of the brain with the eyes closed. And here on the brain map, you can see that would look green if it was in normal amplitude, and this is around 15 microvolts. Here's your microvolts. So that would be within the first standard deviation at 15 microvolts, and it's in the dominant frequency, so it's nice and green here like it should be. And you can see the frequency analysis filter over here showing 10.6 is the actual dominant frequency of this person. When a person's eyes are open and we look at the EEG distribution from 0 to 25 hertz, which is where most of the energy is, you can see clearly, and this is showing the contour maps from the brain map at different points, you can see clearly where the frequencies dominate. Going down here with beta, it looks like it's in front. And then as the person closes their eyes, we can see 10 hertz is especially high right here in the from CZ going back. When you get here, it's more in the very back. So theta tends to be more central and parietal, and just beginning to get in the parietal, and alpha tends to get all the way in the back at the cuneus. They call that area in the occipital region. So eyes open, alpha is lower than delta and theta. You can see right there. And eyes open, alpha is higher than delta and theta. And that's that shift that we have when we shift from the external attention system to the internal attention system. So this would be the external attention system, and this would be the internal attention system. And you can see that the delta is almost just as high frontally. Actually, it is higher than anything else. And that's typical. Okay. Now, alpha is generated through a resonance process between the thalamus in here and the rest of the cortex. And the thalamus is got areas all along its surface that correspond with different areas of the brain. So there are thalamicortical loops, feedback loops going all through the brain that correspond to each area of the brain with areas in the thalamus. And the thalamus resonates with these areas and activates them and deactivates them. And so in the research more recently, and it's been only in the last 10 years they've really acknowledged this, that alpha occurs all throughout the brain at different levels and different times. It's a reflection of dipole layers activating and deactivating as they process information in the cortical process. So alpha is coming and going all over the cortex all the time as we activate and deactivate different regions, and it's a resonance between the thalamus and the cortex, and so we call it resource allocation. Alpha also has an idling rhythm in the motor strip, and that's called mu. And I had to dig around to find a really good example of it. A lot of the examples on mu on the internet are crummy examples. When you see it on your screen, it's very obvious. Some of the examples they have don't show it very clearly. But you can see these look like wickets side to side, the inverted U shapes. And so this got the name of wicket rhythm. And this occurs only in the motor strip. It's an idling rhythm. And at times you'll have children in your office will have this pattern at C3 and C4, and it will be very high in amplitude. It might be 18, 20, 25 microvolts with their eyes open. You know, very huge wicket rhythms. And you'll see it reflected in the background in some of the other frequencies a bit because there's some leakage from the ear clips. It's so powerful. And if you have the child grab hold of something, a toy car or anything, a ball, and have them close their hand, you'll see these frequencies disappear because they only appear when the motor strip is actually idling. And this is one of the ways that we know how the basal ganglia, the thalamus, and the motor strip all work together to create this control mechanism. This is a much more ancient reflection of what's going on with us cognitively. So we were just talking about making the shift between eyes closed and eyes open. That's the virtual version of opening your hand and closing your hand. So it's a pretty interesting process. It's something to think about. Here's a more recent piece of research where they're again looking at these relationships between eyes open and eyes closed, and you can see at the bottom the eyes closed is blue, and that's in the back where we said in that cuneus area. That's where the alpha is most dominant. I mean, it's everywhere, but it's most dominant there, and it's very pronounced. And then we open our eyes and we get frontal beta and frontal delta. And that is typical too. And so we just showed you that previously. So hopefully you got that idea. Now here's the three major networks, the large-scale networks, and I've talked about these many times. We have the default mode network, which is in the posterior, so it involves around PZ and T5, T6, and up more towards FZ. The ventral medial frontal region into FP1. And so when you have your eyes closed, this area dominates. And as you saw when I was showing you that distribution, that theta tends to be in the central and posterior region the most. Interestingly, theta appears most over CZ when you have a sudden insight, which is some interesting research they showed. But it tends to dominate in the posterior region at PZ. So if you put a sensor on the midline, you'll see that theta gets higher and higher until you get to PZ, and then it drops off as you go farther, because that is where the default mode system is, and that's our main self-referential system for, you know, thinking about the future and the past and thinking about other people and what they're thinking about you and all that. And this is where all your rumination takes place here, and that's why in beta, we see this very active, but there's also a version of rumination, which is busy mind, and I'll show you that in a bit, that occurs back there too, and there's a lot of alpha. Okay, if we look at the salience network, that involves the temporal lobes and just pre F3 and F4, that region a bit, and then the anterior cingulate. And that is the network that shifts from here, the default mode, to the central executive. And the central executive involves F3, F4, P3, P4. Those are the dorsolateral frontal regions, and the posterior parietal temporal junctions in the posterior region. And those areas all work together when you have your eyes open and you're focusing outward and processing. So we all do that shift, and the degree to which we can do that shift is very important. The more recent research discusses this shift. Here you see the salience network with the anterior cingulate, and then the central executive network, and then the default mode network. And we're looking at how the sensory areas feed into here, and then they feed back through the salience network. And the ability to shift back and forth is crucial to proper functioning of the brain. And we all know that. And nobody is ever, or they're rarely totally shifted out, unless they're profoundly hypervigilant. And they're not totally centered in unless they're profoundly dissociated. So most people are in a state somewhere in between and moving more or less in one direction or the other. They're kind of moving in degrees, and that fluidity back and forth is important. But a lot of times you'll see in the brain maps we won't have any delta with the eyes closed, but then they open their eyes and delta should increase frontally. But on your brain map you'll see delta going up 1 and 2 standard deviations when they open their eyes. That's because they're not making the full shift from the default mode network, and they're getting delta intrusion and theta, and that's because of sleep deprivation. So you'll see that pretty commonly. Now alpha does produce an artifact, and we talked about that recently when we talked about alpha artifacts. And you can see here it looks monophasic almost. It looks mostly like it's going up, like mountains at the top. And these are isocades that produce this. It's not actual alpha. And you can tell because you can look at the rest of the background and it's not occurring anywhere else. If this was alpha, it should have been occurring also elsewhere in the record, because alpha doesn't usually occur frontally by itself. It usually occurs in the occipital region, and to the degree to which it moves into the posterior temporal and leaks into the reference leads, it will show and move more frontally here, and then eventually it'll show here. In this case, you can see it looks like alpha, but it's just sitting there, and it's not. It's eye movement. So that's why they say, well, look at the background, see what the other frequencies are doing. So there are many disorders related to abnormal alpha activity, and this is a fairly normal way, but you can see we're getting a lot of steady alpha there, which we don't want too much of. Anxiety is too much alpha, and depression is too much alpha. And this confused people a lot when we were first looking at brain maps. And it wasn't until I started looking at asymmetry that the explanation started to emerge, because we will see different asymmetry states, but also different dominant frequency states that distinguish anxiety from depression. And yet they are really all along a continuum. Depression's really just the ultimate expression of inhibitory activity in anxiety. It's end state anxiety. We see thyroid and liver problems in alpha when it's not in a normal pattern. Sleep deprivation, you'll see that, and brain fog and perseverance. So let's look at some of those. Here's late stage anxiety. So notice here we have elevated beta, so this person has a lot of anxiety. They have a lot of muscle tension here and high beta. And but we notice we've also got a lot of alpha. However, if we go down to dominant frequency, the alpha is in normal dominant frequency range. So it's just, it's still 9.5 to 10.5 hertz alpha, but it's really amplified. It's higher than normal. and this is between 1 and 2 standard deviations. If we go down to the asymmetry, we can see that a beta asymmetry is dominating this scene, so we're getting anxiety mostly. Now we've got a little alpha here on the left, which tells us that we're starting to shift into depression, but this is an eyes closed map, and we're seeing a lot of excess activation of the cortical process, and it's starting to exhaust the brain. We're getting too much glutamate buildup. This person isn't going to be sleeping well, and they're going to have problems clearing the brain out at night so that it's fresh in the morning, and there's not still excess glutamate building up and creating inflammation. But as the inflammation does build up from the excess glutamate and the anxiety, we'll see this alpha shift from the right to the left, and we'll see this alpha get higher. But we'll still be in depression at that point. So here's our transition from anxiety to depression. We can see that the brain is starting to lose the ability to produce high frequency activity. The mitochondria are compromised by the inflammatory process. Serotonin is being rerouted to become quinolinic acid. And really what's happening is tyrosine is being routed to quinolinic acid, not to serotonin. So the inflammatory process, the loss of mitochondrial energy, shows beta dropping, inflammation increasing, and we'll start to get some slowing in the alpha. And if you look down at the asymmetries, you'll start to see a much bigger buildup in alpha. But at this point, we've still got as much anxiety as depression, and this person is in mild to moderate depressive state at this point. Now, if we look at what's going on in their here, we can see, I don't want to draw, no thank you. We can see in this person's metabolic profile that they have some thyroid issues starting to develop. The headaches and insomnias from the anxiety. Their adrenals are holding up pretty good. We're seeing they're starting to get blood sugar issues. That's very typical of what's going on in this process. If we look down here, you can see that we have some anxiety right here at a mild level, and we have depression here at starting to get into a moderate level. So we can see that we have that anxiety and depression from their self-report right there, and we can see what the metabolic issues are. Now, in case you had any doubts about depression and alpha asymmetry, there's decades of research on it, and Choi has actually done some research where he trained people who were depressed with asymmetry training, and really showed, it was a nice control group design, that training asymmetry reduces depression. So here we have alpha and depression. So alpha and depression, again, it doesn't look that much different from the anxiety alpha we saw, but notice that all the alpha is on the left and all the beta is on the left down here. Now we still have a normal alpha frequency, this between 9.5 and 10.5 hertz, but we're starting to get a state, and it varies from person to person, where we may have blue here or not. It depends on how much inflammation has built up and how much thyroid T3 they've lost, okay, as a consequence of the inflammatory process. And that's sometimes easier to see. This is interesting because this is one of the things that shows us how alpha shifts. If we look at the alpha here, this is just like the map that we're showing, where we have alpha on one side and beta on one side. This is somebody who's depressed, and their dominant frequency is normal, like we just saw. Now, if you stimulate this person with photic stimulation at 10 hertz, that'll shift their alpha, because when you train somebody with neurofeedback at 10 hertz, it'll shift their alpha. And if you stimulate them at 10 hertz, it'll shift their alpha, because you're pushing the brain from lower frequencies. Like this brain might be at 9.5 or 9.3. It's getting down there. But when you stimulate it at 10 at a higher frequency, you'll see the brain naturally starts to shift. So there's probably about 10 or 20-second difference between here and here where we turned on the photic stimulation. So you notice that when you put in the dominant 10 hertz frequency, the whole brain as a system responds. It shifts the alpha to the right, because when frequency shifts to normal 10 hertz, symmetry shifts to normal symmetry. And you can see the beta is starting to normalize a little bit at this state. We got some beta on the left. If we keep running this at 10 hertz, we'll probably get some beta shifting to the left too. So in case you doubted, there is real-time evidence that the brain responds to a system based upon the frequency you're training. And here's that metabolic profile of depression. You can see thyroid starting to show up more a bit. The adrenals are pretty high, and we've got sleep issues, and there's just your basic garden variety of depression. Now, as depression increases for a lot of people, that's reflecting an anxiety process which is affecting the microbiome. People who are highly anxious have elevated blood sugar, reduced insulin resistance. If they carry on, they lose sleep. They tend to eat more fats and sugars. It's readily available in our diet. That's between the acidic shift in the microbiome and that diet, that'll start to cause inflammation in the gut, which will weaken the tight junctions, release lipopolysaccharides and little bits of protein, and there's an antigen buildup against them. So we get this inflammatory response that affects the thyroid and burdens the liver at the same time. And so as a consequence, we have actually a pretty good correlation between depression and hypothyroid. Now it's only at 0.5 because a lot of people get depressed without having, severe thyroid problems. But this is just to point out that as people move into late-stage anxiety and the brain's becoming inflamed and they're starting to get an inflammatory process and depression there, at the same time, there's a correlational process going in the gut where we're getting inflammation and then inflammation in the interstitial fluid areas outside the gut, and that's affecting thyroid. And the liver is starting to be burdened with dealing with this problem and this inflammation. So we get, for a lot of people, this can end up, if it goes on too long, with an actual thyroid and liver dysfunction process. Usually thyroid, sometimes it's so bad it's Hashimoto's, but a lot of people have loss of thyroid function, and our culture is becoming more rampant because of our diet. So here you can see there's that alpha again. Notice the beta is losing energy, and that's because the mitochondria are compromised by the inflammation, the buildup of calcium in the neurons, and their attempt to deal with it. And now we're starting to get slowing here. And this person has both depression and anxiety in full bloom, and then we're starting to get that blue, which is a slowing in the dominant frequency, in the alpha frequencies, and that is starting to indicate that we're having an issue with slowing in general. Now notice when the alpha slows this much, we're starting to see theta look red. Well, what's happening is the alpha is slowing down to 9 hertz, and then 8.8 hertz, and then 8.2 hertz. And it's as it does that, the digital filters for theta start to pick it up, because the digital filters can't read morphology. They just look purely at frequency. So as the theta slows in frequency, it starts to get picked up by the digital filters, and we see some theta. So this is a classic, very slow alpha. This person definitely has a serious thyroid issue. It's generating this left hemisphere alpha depression, and it's contributing to this alpha in the brain, because the brain's got its independent process, but the white blood cells in the intestinal lining communicate with the white blood cells in the brain, and this creates a bidirectional loop, which just makes things worse. And that was in, I think it was O'Malley et al. 2011. I may have the citation on it, but it's not that long ago that we learned that this was a bidirectional loop. Okay. And you can see here in this person's pattern here, we can see that the thyroid is pretty elevated. They're getting pretty strong thyroid symptoms here at 12. And that'll keep elevating. The adrenals are pretty up there and the blood sugar's up there. It's a pattern you'll commonly see as people get worse. Down here you can see that anxiety and depression are pretty much running even Steven. Now, the other kind of alpha that we talked about was perseverance. And here we have a perseverance case. You can get alpha in the front, that's just brain fog, and that shows up with sleep a lot, sleep deprivation a lot. But here we have alpha in the back. Now notice the other frequencies are pretty green. We've got some theta in the back that's blue. That's an indicator that they've had cortisol levels pretty high for a while, and it's affecting hippocampal and memory function. They're starting to lose some frontal energy. And this person's perseverating. Whenever you see this posterior alpha like that, you can be guaranteed they perseverate. And Rob noted independently, they also tend not to sleep well either. And that's typical, of course, if you've got a busy mind and you're perseverating. Now, that's distinct from somebody who's negatively ruminating, but they're both versions of automatic thoughts, except this one is not quite so referentially negative, self-referentially negative. But we can see that the alpha's fast here, and it's posterior, and they're constantly thinking about their to-do list. And you can see here how they rated themselves. If we look here at these, this is the CEC from that same map, and you can see they have trouble filtering. Their mind wanders in conversations, difficulty with attention and multitasking, reread a paragraph many times, get stuck on ideas, thoughts, or behaviors. See, that's a key one you want to look for when you have alpha in the back. They feel manic, and they're not manic, they're just perseverant. They're just doing their to-do list all the time in their head. And some of them talk constantly because they're anxious and they have impulse control issues. So this is a profile of somebody that might get labels as attention deficit, but really what's going on is that they're perseverant and it's interfering with their other processing tasks. They're getting pulled back from their central executive or their external attention system. They're getting pulled constantly in to their automatic internal ongoing to-do list. And of course, it gets really loud at night when they try to go to sleep. And here's an example. Rob did this with somebody with alpha theta. Here's a person with that high posterior perseverance. And Rob said, "What are you thinking about now?" And it came down. And then he waited and went back up. And his person was doing alpha theta for a while. And Rob said, "Well, tell me what you're thinking about now." And then he came down and he told him what he thought about. And they went back up. And then Rob said, "Well, tell me again now, what are you thinking about?" And it would go down. So you can see that as the person shifts from a more dissociative internal default mode state, and Rob says, "What are you thinking about now?" There's a burst of alpha. The salience system shifts. The person's attention system wakes up. Part of the external system starts working, and they answer Rob. And then there's another burst of alpha, and then it shifts and goes back. And then he's sitting there, and then we have that same pattern again. So this is a shifting back and forth between the internal and external attention systems. And here's somebody with too much alpha, eyes open, and you can see how crummy their convergence and compression is. The two delta lines are far apart, the two theta lines are far apart, the two beta lines are far apart. This brain is not well integrated. The left and right hemispheres are not cooperating well. We might see a fair amount of coherence issues because of this. And what's going to happen is as we train this person, okay, this alpha, you can see it's starting to come down here. This is an early session, and it's coming down. You can see it's starting to get close more as it comes down. But as we train this person, we move into this state. So we go from here, too fast, to here, right? So we started up 20 to 15. Then by session 35, we're down to 10 to 15 or even lower. And then finally at the end, we're down here. You know, our goal is to get that alpha and theta and delta to look like that. And that's what you're looking for on your screen. But it's this process of activating the brain, speeding the alpha up. The slowed alpha is higher than the normal alpha because it's easier for the brain to produce slow frequencies. As the brain gets more energy, the alpha amplitude drops and the brain becomes more integrated, and we get a brain that's integrated. And at that point, when you see that on your trend screen, you go like, oh, okay, time to move to a new location. We have integrated that area. And that's why we talk about it that way. Now, if you were to look at z-scores at the same time, you would see the z-scores normalizing across the board for coherence, phase, symmetry, everything. Now, Sterman did some research on this back in the 90s, I think it was, and he took some experienced pilots and they did simulated taxi, takeoff, departure, cruise, refueling, and landing, day and night conditions. Yeah, it was 1995, in a B2 simulator, and he found state shifts as measured by alpha corresponding with the quality of pilot performance. So alpha is related very much to performance for those of you interested in big performance. Pilots shifted from at-rest alpha frequencies to beta frequencies when on task, and that's been a theme through this whole discussion. You saw how that occurs. Pilots shift back to alpha frequencies when the task was completed. Pilots who failed to shift or were slow to shift back to alpha between tasks performed more poorly. And pilots who shift back to the resting state consistently and more rapidly significantly outperformed other pilots. So this mirrors all of the new research you saw about the ability to shift in the brain, to shift left to right, front to back. That plasticity is crucial. And that's what we're trying to get when we're training people. And another researcher looking into the same things said, our research results indicate that flight procedural complexity modulates the EEG power spectrum. Cognitive demanding procedures induced higher EEG power with the higher frequency bands, whereas less demanding procedures induce lower EEG power over the same frequency bands. So that's the power shift. Now, when it comes to other performance research, going back as far as 91, we found that training people for being able to make that shift and training people for alpha 10 hertz dominance was very effective at helping pre-elite archers, at golfing and putting, and marksmen's shooters. So I have been, since the 90s, training people who wanted to get better at golf. You know, first we do 2-channel training to make sure they're not depressed or have, you know, frontal cognitive issues. And then we go in the back and we train alpha up at 10 hertz. And then we do bihemispheric training at 10 hertz. And we're training the brain to become quiet, flexible, and in the zone, in this neural quiescent zone, so that it can shift and move in any direction very quickly. We're really training neural balance. And that is exactly what meditation does. So if we look at the earliest studies on Zen monks and meditation, what we find is that same kind of pattern occurring, but in this case, people are sitting quietly and they're moving progressively into a diffuse global alpha state. Now, the alpha begins in the back of the cuneus, and it gathers power over 10 or 15 minutes until it engulfs the brain. And as it does it, the alpha power drops down in frequency, like an alpha theta, And we get this unique state. A lot of people just fall asleep, you know. They start to get into a 7 to 8 hertz theta range, which is really slowed alpha if you look at the record carefully. So their alpha is slowing. They're moving into the state between sleeping and waking, but what's happening is they're learning to remain alert as they move into the state. It's a state of neural quiescence, and when the brain moves into the state, the heart rate and the breath rate and the EEG all start to synchronize. We call it the Mayer wave effect. And as they synchronize, these people move into an altered state of neural integration, which is profound and often causes profound experiences in their life. Maxwell Cade did specific research in the same area in England years later, and found that people who were early meditators, their alpha, after 2 to 5 years practice, they could get it down to 9 hertz without falling asleep. And that people who practiced 10 to 20 years of meditation could get down into the 7 to 8 hertz range. So he clearly showed in his research that this is what was occurring. And if you look at the big picture in the record, this is traditional Theravadan meditation. This is traditional Buddhist meditation. This is even traditional Indian meditation if we're looking for concentrative meditation. They all produce this same pattern, and so does mantra meditation, as research over a period of 20 years or more by the TM people, and they've got very good research on that as well. All right, so that's what we know. And if we look at Dunn et al., it's actually Dunn and Dunn. They also looked at that and found that a key feature of meditation versus concentrated meditation that separated out from mindfulness and relaxation, because it is different. Mindfulness is a different state than standard concentrative meditation, which is the dominant form that emerged in all the Asian cultures, and even in the West, if you look at the right literature, that the key feature was alpha in the posterior, but also central region. Okay, so let's see if we can open this up. I'm going to push the unmute all participants button and see if it does anything. And I don't know that it did anything. Nope. So the unmute all button doesn't unmute, so I'll just start unmuting people manually. Okay, so you are being unmuted. And please mute yourself unless you have something you want to mention or talk about. If you have any questions or comments on anything that we covered here, feel free to bring it up.
I have a question, Richard.
Yes.
This is Carl.
Carl.
You mentioned, I think you mentioned one of the slides where it's showing the various brainwaves crisscrossing over each other, that when that happens, then it's time to move to a different location?
Yes.
Because that area is integrated, I think that's what you said?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's exactly correct. Yeah, and that's what I try to communicate to everybody, but it's, it's not always clear. It's not always obvious when you're first looking at it. It takes a while to kind of grasp that. I mean, it took us 20 years to grasp it, so I'm not surprised. It takes time for most people to kind of really tune into the fact that once you get to that point, let's see if we can go back to that. When you go from here to here to here, when you're seeing that clear pattern, and I try to tell everybody this when I first show them how to use the software when they meet with me, that means that you've integrated that region, that network area, and it's time to move on to another network area. It's a very...
So what network area how do you know which one that would be best to work on next?
Usually it's listed in the, you get 2 locations on the map. Yeah. And you would move to the second location.
Okay.
And there's an alternative. I mean, if it's been a rocky road or you're fairly new, it might be helpful to remap and look at the protocols there. So you have two options. You could move to the next location or remap. Sometimes what happens when people move to the next location, it's only 1 or 2 sessions and it looks like this because you happen to land on the area that was most responsive and causing the most trouble. And so when you go to the next location, it doesn't take much to get it there. You'll get that right away, in which case you're going to have to remap to get the whole new picture.
Okay, thank you.
Ideal world.
How long how long do clinicians typically stay at that first location?
Oh, it varies so much, Valerie, because of individual differences and physiological problems and hidden trauma in the family or workplace. You could say on average, when we look at the statistics from our database, it's around 15 sessions, 12 to 15 sessions for people to normalize. That's a range, of course. Sometimes you'll see it happen at 8. Sometimes it won't get there till 20, 22. But the big range is somewhere between 8 and 22. You should see it. If you're not seeing it by 20 sessions, 22 sessions, if you're not seeing something like this, that means you're got something else working against you. I mean, even if it's not exactly the right place, you should still see significant movement towards this. If you're not getting that, and I'd say personally by 15 sessions, I don't want to waste time. If I'm not seeing some changes pretty close to this, I'm going to go, there's something else going on here. We need to look at the microbiome, or we need to look at the family system.
So you don't recommend doing 5 sessions at the number 1 and then trying 5 at number 2 and looking where the
I do. I think that's the way you should start off, and then go until the one that's most responsive cleans up. And then you could go to the second one, and it may change very quickly, in which case you'd have to remap, or you may end up training at the second one longer for a while. I think it's about as clear cut as you can get. There's kind of a decision tree there.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Good questions. Interesting that people were tuning into that aspect. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, we seem to have satisfied everybody's interest on this.
Just a quick